Hello everyone, here I'm going to talk about the gross features of thalamus. This is a median sagittal view of the brain. So this is the right half of the cerebral hemisphere. Here middle there is the corpus callosum. You can see here this is the thalamus, okay, which lies in the interior of the cerebral hemisphere. It's a part of this diencephalon. The other parts are here in this antero-inferior of the thalamus. Here this area is the hypothalamus. Posterior of this thalamus, you can see here this is the pineal gland with this posterior commissure and habenular commissure, which forms this the epithalamus. Then here inferiorly you can see this is the brainstem, which consists of this midbrain, pons and the medulla. Then you can see this is the tegmentum of this midbrain. Here it continues, here is a part of this subthalamus. So these forms the parts of the diencephalon. You can see here this is the thalamus or the dorsal thalamus. Okay. Here in this figure, that is the closer view of this thalamus. Okay, this is the right half of the cerebral hemisphere, towards anteriorly, towards posteriorly. You can see this is the corpus callosum. This is the thalamus. It has towards anteriorly. This is the anterior pole. Towards posteriorly, this area is the posterior pole. So this is the right half, like that left half is there. So here this forms the medial surface of the thalamus, the medial surface. Okay, here deep to this corpus callosum, here this is the septum pellucidum, this nervous tissue. Deep to that lies the lateral ventricle. Okay, so this is communication here. This foramen is the interventricular foramen of this Monroe. Between this thalamus and hypothalamus, here the cavity here, that is the third ventricle. Okay, here this lies the third ventricle. So this is the midbrain, pons, this is cerebellum. Between here there is the cavity between the cerebellum and this pons. This is the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle communicates with this third ventricle here through this one, that is the cerebral aqueduct. This is the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so this thalamus and this hypothalamus separated by here the sulcus, that is the hypothalamic sulcus here, which leads into this one, that is the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, then in this figure you can see this large mass of this gray matter. This is the thalamus. They removed the cerebral hemisphere's corpus callosum and all. Here you can see the thalamus with the cerebellum. Here middle, this is the part of the midbrain is also there, that is the brainstem. This is the posterior view. So this is towards anteriorly, this is towards posteriorly. Here this is laterally. Here this is the right one, this is the left one. So here we'll get the medial surface inside. Then here this is the anterior pole. Here this area is the posterior pole of this thalamus, like that. This is the posterior, the anterior. The posterior pole is called the pulvinar. Okay, then this is the superior surface. Okay, this one is the lateral surface. Here in between these two thalamus, here there you can see there is a cavity. Here there lies this third ventricle. Okay, then here we'll get the medial surface. Like that, there is an inferiorly, there is the inferior surface. Okay, these are the external features of this thalamus. Then we'll see the relations. Okay, here you can see this is the posterior pole. This is the posterior part of this one, midbrain. There you can see these four elevations there. So this forms the superior colliculus. Here this is the inferior colliculus. This inferior colliculus is connected to this medial geniculate body by here, this area. This is the inferior brachium. That is the part of this auditory pathway. Here the superior colliculus here is connected to this lateral geniculate body. Here by this connection will be there, that is the superior brachium. It's a part of the visual pathway that forms the posterior relations. The posterior pole is also called the pulvinar. Then in this figure you can clearly see this, the superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, this inferior brachium, medial geniculate body, lateral geniculate body, superior brachium. This forms the posterior relations. Okay. here this is the thalamus, this is the posterior of this midbrain. So this is the cerebellum. Here this figure, you can see this each thalamus is connected by this gray matter. This is called the interthalamic adhesions. This is the interthalamic adhesions. Here you can see which is from here this cavity here, that is the third ventricle. Here gets the medial surface. Here this is again the sagittal view of this cerebral hemisphere, shows anteriorly, posteriorly. You can see this is the thalamus, the corpus callosum. This is the midbrain, pons, cerebellum, the hypothalamus. See here, this is the anterior pole which relates to this interventricular foramen. It also will get the internal cerebral veins there. Okay, this forms the superior surface. Okay, superior surface here, it relates to this fornix, here this part. Then here this is the inferior surface. Here we'll get the inferior relations are this andro-inferior, this is the hypothalamus. Here you can see this is the cerebral peduncle of this midbrain, then cerebral aqueduct. These forms the inferior relations. Then here this is the posterior pole. Posterior pole we have seen the relation superior and inferior colliculus. Then this is the splenium of the corpus callosum, this part that also forms the posterior relations. Here in this sagittal view, the first figure, here you can see this is the thalamus. This is the interthalamic adhesions. Each thalamus connected by a gray matter, that is the interthalamic adhesions. You can see this is the superior surface. It relates to this fornix, and this one is the choroid plexus. Here this is the choroid plexus and this is the fornix, which forms the superior surface relations. Here this is the hypothalamic sulcus. Here this is hypothalamus, cerebral peduncle. This is the cerebral aqueduct that forms the inferior relations. Then this is the frontal view. We have taken a coronal section of the brain to superiorly, inferiorly, laterally. This is the toes medially. Okay, each half of the cerebral hemisphere. You can see this is the thalamus here. This white matter is the cerebrum. Here you can see these fibers. These are called the internal capsule. This forms the lateral relations. The thalamus. Here you can see this cavity. This is the third ventricle. Okay. Then coming to this nucleus of this thalamus. Here you can see this is the right one, like that. There is the left is there. So there is an internal medullary lamina, Y-shaped internal medullary lamina here, which divides this thalamus into anterior group of nuclei. This is the anterior groups. This is the lateral groups. Then there is the medial groups of nuclei. Okay. Then here this anterior group, and this is the medial, or this nuclei is called the medial dorsal nuclei. Then this lateral group includes, there is a lateral, ventral and the dorsal groups. Okay, so here you can see this is the Y-shaped internal medullary lamina, divides into anterior, lateral and medial group of nuclei. Then this lateral groups has a ventral group and the dorsal groups. This is the ventral group and this one is the dorsal group. The dorsal groups includes here, this is the lateral dorsal, then there is a lateral posterior, and there is a posterior nuclei that is called the pulvinar. This one is the pulvinar. Okay, that comes under the lateral dorsal groups. So this is the lateral dorsal group nuclei. This is the lateral posterior nuclei. Then here you can see this is the pulvinar nuclei. Okay. Then coming to this ventral lateral groups, this area is the ventral lateral group, includes the ventral anterior, ventral intermediate and the ventral posterior nuclei. So this is the ventral anterior nuclei, this is the ventral intermediate nuclei, then here this is the ventral posterior nuclei. Here you can see this is the left one. Here you can see this is the internomedullary lamina, this is a white matter, this is the anterior nuclei, this is the medial, or this one is the medial dorsal nuclei. Then here this entire area that comes under the lateral group of nuclei. This lateral group of nuclei here, it divides into, there is a ventral and the dorsal groups. Okay. In the ventral group includes the ventral anterior, ventral lateral or intermediate, and there is the ventral posterior. This dorsal group, lateral dorsal groups includes, there is the lateral dorsal nuclei, then this is the lateral posterior nuclei, and here you can see this is the pulvinar nuclei. Okay, these are the nuclei of this thalamus. Then coming to this connections, important connections of this thalamus. Here this is the diagrammatic representation. Here you can see this is the thalamus. Here it's divides into an anterior, lateral and medial groups. Okay, so this is the anterior nuclei, this is the lateral groups of nuclei, this is the medial nuclei, and this here, this is the posterior nuclei or this pulvinar. Then this lateral groups includes the ventral and dorsal. Dorsal I am not showing in this. In this ventral here divides into a ventral anterior, then ventral intermediate and the ventral posterior groups. Okay, this is the ventral anterior, here this is the ventral intermediate and this is the ventral posterior. This ventral posterior group, this is the ventral posterior. Okay, it has a ventral posterolateral and ventral posteromedial division is there. Okay, we have seen the ventral nuclei here. Back to this diagram. So this is the internomedullary lamina, this is the medial dorsal nuclei, this is the anterior nuclei, this is the lateral groups. It has a ventral anterior, ventral lateral or ventral intermediate, this is the ventral posterior, this is the posterior or the pulvinar. Then here you can see this is the lateral dorsal, this is the lateral posterior. Okay, then coming to this ventral posterior nuclei, here you can see this is the ventral posterior. It has two divisions. This area, this is the ventral posterolateral. Here this is the ventral posteromedial. Okay, this is towards laterally, that is ventral posterolateral. Here this is towards medially, so this is the ventral posteromedial. Okay, then back to this connections. Here is the anterior, this is the medial, this is the pulvinar, this is the ventral anterior, this is the ventral intermediate, then here this is the ventral posterior. It has ventral posterolateral and ventral posteromedial. Okay. Then this anterior nuclei here, which receives informations from this mammillary bodies, here receives inputs or this efferents from the mammillary bodies through the mammillothalamic tract. Okay, and sends outputs here, then here it sends outputs to the mainly to the limbic lobe, that is the cingulate gyrus, the inferior surface of the cerebrum. You can see the cingulate gyrus there. Okay, then here this area and this nuclei here is involved in emotion and mood. Okay, responsible for this emotion and mood. Then this dorsal nuclei here each one receives informations from the basal ganglia, then mainly from this basal ganglia, then it sends outputs to the prefrontal cortex, that is to the area number 9, 10 and 11, which is responsible for the personality. Okay, here medial nuclei. Okay, here it sends output to this prefrontal cortex. Okay, then coming to this ventral anterior and ventral intermediate nuclei, this both here which receives informations from here, this basal ganglia, then the cerebellum. Okay, then here these two nuclei here, it sends outputs to this motor and the premotor area of the cerebral cortex. Motor area, that is the 4 here, and this area number 6. Okay, motor and the premotor areas of this cerebral cortex. Okay, then coming to this ventral posterior group of nuclei. Okay, then it has ventral posterolateral and ventral posteromedial is there. This one ventral posterolateral here, which receives the general sensations, okay, that both this exteroceptive and proprioceptive impulses through this one, through this spinothalamic tract and this medial lemniscus to this ventroposterolateral nuclei. Okay, then this posteromedial nuclei, which receives this exteroceptive and proprioceptive impulses to the trigeminothalamic tract. Okay, to this trigeminothalamic tract. The ventral posterolateral here, which receives this sensory informations from whole of the body except the head. Okay, posteromedial here, ventral posteromedial, which receives this exteroceptive and proprioceptive impulses of the head through the spinothalamic tract. Okay, then here it's relays there to this nuclei, and here it sends output to the sensory area of the cerebral cortex. Okay, that is to this area numbers, that is the 3, 1, 2. Okay, then you can see here the posteriorly, this is the left half, this is the medial geniculate body here, this is the lateral geniculate body, this is the pulvinar. Okay, so this here, this is the medial geniculate body here, that one it receives informations from this inferior colliculus, then through this pulvinar. Okay, then sent outputs to this temporal gyrus, that is to the superior temporal gyrus through the area numbers 41 and 42. Okay, here you can see this is the lateral geniculate body here, which receives informations, that is from the optic tract. Okay, then through this pulvinar and sent outputs to this occipital lobe or the occipital cortex, that is the mainly to this visual area, primary visual area, that is the area number 17. Okay. Here you can see this one here, this thalamus. Okay, so this thalamus receives sensory and motor informations. Okay, through this mainly through this, you can see I already told this main tracks. Okay, then here in this thalamus, these informations are integrated and it's processing. Okay, so here this thalamus act as a relay station of the central nervous system. Okay, so it receives all the sensory informations except this olfactory impulses. This is not directly reaching to the thalamus, but it is reaching through this amygdaloid complex. Okay, and relayed. So it is acts as a relay center before it reaches to the higher centers of the brain, that is through the cerebral cortex. Then, so we can summarize here the outputs of the thalamus. Okay, here you can see this the thalamus shows anterior, this posterior. You can see the frontal lobe, this occipital lobe. Here there is a parietal, temporal. So the outputs of the thalamus that forms the thalamic radiations. Okay, from here there is the anteriorly, and this one medial and nuclei. There is the outputs through this cingulate gyrus, and there is towards the prefrontal cortex, okay, which forms the anterior thalamic radiations. Okay. From this lateral group of nuclei, okay, it sends outputs to this motor and sensory areas that forms the superior thalamic radiations. Okay. From this lateral geniculate body here, it sends here through this pulvinar, it sends outputs to the visual area that forms the posterior thalamic radiation. Then this is towards the occipital lobe. Then from this medial geniculate body to this pulvinar, okay, it sends outputs to the superior temporal gyrus that forms the here inferior thalamic radiations. So this is the anterior, this is the superior, posterior and inferior thalamic radiations. Okay. So that's about this nuclei and the main connections of the thalamus. Here is the question. Describe the thalamic nuclei with the connections. Okay. Hope you understood. Thank you.